For as long as I could remember, my days had been a series of carefully arranged moments. Morning coffee, reading the paper, an hour tending the garden, and then inevitably a trip to the grocery store. These routines had been my anchors, keeping me grounded after my children left home and my divorce finalized a decade ago. I convinced myself I was content with the predictability. The loneliness clung to the corners of my life like dust I could never quite sweep away. That particular Tuesday felt no different. The overhead lights of the grocery store hummed softly, and the sterile scent of cleaning supplies mixed with the faint aroma of fresh bread from the bakery aisle. I pushed my cart absently, scanning the shelves for my usual staples, when a low, rich sound cut through my haze of routine. I turned, and there he was. He couldn't have been more than 35, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, and a smile that seemed to light the whole aisle. He was chatting with the store clerk, holding a carton of eggs in one hand and gesturing animatedly with the other. It was the kind of easy charm I hadn't seen in years. For a moment, I felt like an intruder, eavesdropping on a life far more vibrant than my own. As I reached for a loaf of bread, my cart nudged his. He turned to me, and our eyes met, his a warm, earthy brown. "Sorry about that," he said, his voice tinged with amusement. "No, it's my fault," I replied, feeling uncharacteristically flustered. "Busy store today," he added with a grin, glancing at my near-empty cart. I laughed softly, a sound that surprised even me. Or maybe I'm just a slow shopper. He chuckled and stepped aside, gesturing for me to pass. "Take your time. Life's too short to rush bread selection." As he walked away, I caught myself smiling, a real, unguarded smile. It was nothing, I told myself, just a fleeting moment of kindness from a stranger. But as I finished my shopping, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, like a small crack had formed in the armor I'd built around my quiet, lonely life. The following week, I found myself lingering in the same aisle at the same grocery store, my heart betraying me with a faint, foolish hope. It was absurd, really. What were the chances I'd see him again? And yet, when I heard that familiar laugh, my pulse quickened like a schoolgirl's. He was at the end of the aisle, comparing labels on jars of marinara sauce. For a moment I hesitated, unsure if I should approach him or slip away unnoticed. But then he turned, and our eyes met again. "Hey, the slow shopper," he said with a teasing smile. I laughed, feeling my cheeks warm. "That's me. You're the bread philosopher, right?" He grinned, and just like that, the conversation unfolded effortlessly. His name was Daniel, and he worked as a freelance graphic designer. He had a warmth about him, an openness that made it easy to talk, even for someone like me, who had grown used to keeping her guard up. Over the next several weeks, our paths seemed to cross more often. At first it was sporadic, an exchange of pleasantries in the produce section or a shared chuckle over the absurd price of avocados. But soon, we were lingering longer, chatting about everything from favorite recipes to childhood memories. "Have you ever tried making your own pasta?" he asked one day, leaning casually on his cart. I shook my head. "That sounds ambitious." "It's easier than you think," he said with an infectious enthusiasm. "Maybe I'll write down a recipe for you sometime." I felt a flutter in my chest at the thought, but I quickly dismissed it. He was just being kind, I told myself. Still, I began to notice how much lighter I felt after our conversations, how his presence seemed to color my otherwise gray days. One afternoon, as we stood by the deli counter debating the merits of different cheeses, I realized something that startled me. I was laughing, really laughing, in a way I hadn't in years. "You've got a great laugh," Daniel said suddenly, his tone sincere. I paused, caught off guard by the compliment. "Thank you," I murmured, feeling a warmth spread through me. That night, as I sat alone in my kitchen, his words echoed in my mind. For so long, I had thought of myself as invisible, blending into the background of my own life. But Daniel saw me, and somehow, that simple recognition began to fill a space in me I hadn't realized was empty. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when I first allowed myself to acknowledge what had been quietly growing in the back of my mind. Daniel and I had planned to meet for coffee after yet another grocery store run turned into a spirited debate about which local cafe brewed the best cappuccino. Sitting across from him in a corner booth, the rain streaking the window beside us, I felt an unfamiliar sense of ease. Daniel's stories tumbled out in bursts of energy. His latest project, his love for old black and white films, the way his mom used to bake cookies every Sunday when he was a kid. I found myself leaning in, captivated not just by his words but by the way he spoke them, as if every detail of life was a small treasure. And then it happened, a fleeting moment that changed everything. He brushed a crumb from the corner of my mouth with his thumb. The gesture was so casual, so unthinking. Yet it sent a jolt through me. I froze, searching his face for any sign that he'd felt it too. But he only smiled, oblivious, and returned to sipping his coffee. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind replayed every moment, every word, every glance. I tried to reason with myself. Daniel was simply kind, attentive. It didn't mean anything. And yet, my chest tightened at the thought. The realization struck me like a sudden gust of wind. I was falling for him. The absurdity of it made me laugh out loud in the quiet of my room. But the laughter quickly dissolved into something heavier. What was I thinking? He was young, vibrant, with his whole life ahead of him. And me? I was, well, me. A woman in her 50s, set in her ways, with a past full of disappointments and a future I had long stopped dreaming about. The next day, I avoided the grocery store altogether, telling myself it was for the best. But as the hours dragged on, I realized how much I missed him, his laughter, his stories, the way he made me feel seen. By evening, my emotions swirled into a storm of confusion. I was caught between the thrill of this newfound connection and the nagging voice in my head, warning me of all the reasons it could never work. I sat by the window, staring out into the dark, rain-soaked street. For years, I had built walls around my heart, convinced that love, if it ever came again, would be safer, easier, devoid of risk. But Daniel had slipped through the cracks, bringing with him a light I hadn't realized I'd been yearning for. And now I was left with a question I couldn't answer. Could I allow myself to want something I was so certain I didn't deserve? The days that followed were a blur of conflicting emotions. I tried to carry on with my usual routine, but it was impossible to focus. Daniel's face lingered in my thoughts, his laughter echoing in moments of silence. I avoided the grocery store for a week, convincing myself it was the best way to regain control over my feelings. But the emptiness that settled in its place was unbearable. One evening, as I sat in my kitchen, my hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea, I began to confront the truth. I wasn't just afraid of falling for Daniel, I was terrified of what people would think if they knew. The age gap felt like a mountain I wasn't sure I could climb. Society had taught me to believe that a relationship like this was unnatural, selfish even. I imagined the whispers, the judgment, the knowing looks from friends and strangers alike. I reached for a notebook I kept tucked away in a drawer. Writing had always been my refuge, a way to sort through the chaos of my mind. Why him? I scribbled, underlining the words. The answers came tumbling out like water from a broken dam. He made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. With him, I wasn't just a lonely woman in her 50s trudging through life. I was someone worth listening to, worth knowing. But the fears crept back in, as relentless as waves crashing against a shore. What if this was a phase for him, a fleeting interest in someone different? What if I misread every kind gesture, every shared laugh, and ruined the fragile connection we'd built? The notebook blurred as tears filled my eyes. "You're being ridiculous," I whispered to myself. "Get a grip, for heaven's sake." Yet, as much as I wanted to push it all away, I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. I cared for Daniel, and it wasn't something I could simply erase. I spent hours pacing the house, wrestling with my emotions. Every time I thought of ending our friendship to save myself from potential heartbreak, the thought of never seeing him again left me hollow. Finally, I picked up my phone. My fingers hovered over his name in my contacts. Just seeing it there, Daniel, made my heart race. I wanted to hear his voice, to feel the warmth of his presence, even if it was only through the phone. But I couldn't bring myself to call. Instead, I sent a simple message. "Hi Daniel, would you like to grab coffee later this week? Let me know when you're free." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The moment I hit send, the doubts rushed back in. But somewhere, buried beneath the fear, was a flicker of hope, a quiet voice urging me to take a step, however small, toward the possibility of something more. The coffee date was a balm for my anxious heart. Daniel arrived with his usual ease, a small paper bag in hand. "Thought you might like these," he said, revealing a selection of pastries. His thoughtfulness made me smile, and as we sipped our drinks, the tension I had carried for days began to melt away. We talked about everything and nothing. The books he was reading, the places I dreamed of visiting, and the quirks of life that made us laugh until our sides hurt. It was in moments like these that I felt the invisible wall between us begin to crumble. As we parted ways, he hesitated, his eyes searching mine. "I always enjoy these talks," he said. "You have a way of making the world feel less heavy." His words stayed with me long after we said goodbye, replaying in my mind as I paced my living room that evening. The idea had been simmering for days, but now it burned brightly. I wanted to invite him over. It wasn't about romance, or at least that's what I told myself. I wanted to share my world with him, to let him see the part of me that existed outside our coffee shop conversations. Yet, the thought of making the first move felt daunting. What if he misinterpreted it? What if it was too forward? I spent the next day preparing, oscillating between excitement and apprehension. By the time I picked up my phone, I had rehearsed a dozen versions of how to ask him. Finally, I settled on something casual. "Hi, Daniel. I was wondering if you'd like to come by my place sometime. I could make us dinner, it's nothing fancy, just thought it'd be nice." I hit send before I could overthink it and stared at the screen, my heart thudding in my chest. The minutes felt like hours as I waited for his reply. When my phone buzzed, I nearly dropped it in my haste to read his message. "I'd love that. How about tomorrow evening?" Relief flooded through me, followed quickly by a rush of nervous energy. Tomorrow. It was happening. The rest of the day was a blur of preparation. I chose a simple menu: a roasted chicken with herbs, a fresh salad, and a dessert of homemade lemon tart. Cooking had always been a comfort for me, a way to channel my emotions into something tangible. By the time the evening arrived, my home was filled with the warm aroma of food, and my heart was a mix of excitement and trepidation. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath and opened the door to find Daniel standing there, a bottle of wine in hand, and a smile that made my nerves dissolve. "Thanks for inviting me," he said, stepping inside. "It smells amazing in here." As we settled into the evening, the atmosphere was surprisingly relaxed. He complimented the meal, we shared stories, and the soft glow of the candles on the table made everything feel intimate yet unspoken. Still, there was an unspoken current beneath the surface, a quiet electricity that neither of us dared to name. As we moved to the living room with our glasses of wine, I realized that tonight was more than just a dinner. It was the next step in a journey I hadn't expected but now couldn't imagine stopping. The evening stretched on, the minutes slipping by unnoticed as we talked and laughed, the conversation flowing effortlessly. The space between us had shrunk, replaced by a warmth I hadn't anticipated. I watched him move around my living room, his presence filling the corners of the quiet space, and I found myself growing more comfortable, more at ease with every passing moment. As the night wore on, our casual conversation started to deepen. The topics shifted from the mundane to the more personal. We shared memories, his childhood spent in a small town, my stories of life in the city, of adventures and heartbreaks, of lessons learned. There was an openness between us, a raw honesty that made the air feel charged with something more than friendship. At one point, Daniel stood up and walked over to the bookshelf near the window, scanning the titles, his fingers brushing against the spines of books I hadn't touched in years. "You like poetry?" he asked, pulling out a worn copy of Yeats. I nodded, watching him with a feeling of fondness I hadn't expected. "It's been a while since I've read much. Life's just busy, you know." He smiled, a small, knowing smile that made something shift inside me. "I get that. But sometimes we need to make room for the things that matter." I couldn't tell if he meant the poetry or something else, but his words lingered in my mind as we continued our conversation. There was a gentleness about him, something that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. As the evening drew to a close, we found ourselves standing by the door. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. It was hard to know what I was feeling: joy, anticipation, something more. "Thank you for tonight," Daniel said softly, his voice carrying an earnestness that made my heart skip a beat. "It was really nice, I smiled, a mix of warmth and vulnerability flooding me. It was, "I'm glad you came." For a moment, we stood there in silence, and then, as if on instinct, I reached out and touched his arm. The simple gesture felt electric, as if the boundaries that had existed between us were slipping away. Daniel's gaze met mine, his eyes darker now, the playful glint replaced by something deeper, more focused. He leaned in, just slightly, and I felt my breath catch in my throat. "I should go," he murmured, his voice thick with unspoken things. "But I'll see you soon, right?" I nodded, my heart racing as I stepped back to let him go. "Of course," he smiled, a smile that held promise, and then he was gone, leaving me standing in the doorway, my heart still pounding in the quiet of my apartment. I closed the door behind me, leaning against it for a moment, trying to steady my breath. Something had shifted tonight, something that felt both thrilling and terrifying. The connection between us was undeniable, and for the first time, I allowed myself to truly feel it. The warmth of his presence still lingered in the room, a reminder of the intimacy we had shared. The quiet spaces between us had filled with meaning, and in those moments, I realized just how much I had come to care for him, more than I had ever expected, more than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. But there was a truth I couldn't ignore. This was more than friendship. It was something deeper, something neither of us could pretend to overlook. And as I sat in the stillness of my apartment, I knew that my life had changed forever. The days following Daniel's visit were a blur of emotions I had trouble sorting out. The initial rush of excitement settled into something quieter, deeper. I found myself replaying every moment of that evening. The way his eyes had softened when he spoke to me, the warmth of his smile, the quiet way he made me feel valued. I couldn't deny it any longer. I had feelings for him. Not just a fleeting attraction, but something that felt far more profound, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. I was scared, not just by the intensity of my emotions, but by the fear of what they might mean. At 54, I had spent so much of my life believing that romance and love were things of youth, things I'd missed out on because of life's twists and turns. But now, with Daniel, I was starting to question that. Why should love have an expiration date? Why should age stand in the way of something so raw, so real? I sat in the small garden behind my apartment, the early spring air crisp and refreshing. The flowers were just beginning to bloom, and I couldn't help but think that in some ways, my own heart was blossoming in a way it hadn't in decades. But the doubts came creeping in, relentless. What would people think? What did it mean for a woman of my age to be so drawn to someone so much younger? Would Daniel's friends think it was strange? Would his family even approve? And what about my own friends, my peers? The judgments and whispers that would follow. Society often had a way of making us feel like certain things, certain connections, were simply off limits based on age, especially for women. But as I sat there, watching the wind move gently through the branches of the trees, I realized how much I had already allowed fear to control me. I had lived a life that was careful, measured, defined by routines and safe choices. But in the quiet moments of reflection, I couldn't help but wonder, what if there was more? What if this connection was the thing that I had been waiting for, even if I didn't fully understand it yet? I wasn't naive. I knew the complications that came with an age gap like ours. I could see the judgmental looks, feel the whisper of disapproval from those who didn't understand. But at that moment, I felt a deep sense of peace, perhaps for the first time in years, at the thought of embracing this connection, this unexpected chapter of my life. Daniel had brought a newness into my life, a spark of something I thought was long gone. He made me feel seen, heard, valued in a way I hadn't in a long time. I wasn't simply the woman who had lived a quiet, predictable life. I was someone deserving of affection, of intimacy, of passion. As I sat in the garden, I realized something else, something perhaps even more important than the fear and doubt. Love was not defined by age or expectations. Love simply was, and it had found me when I least expected it. I took a deep breath, letting the air fill my lungs, feeling a sense of hope settling in my chest. I had no idea what the future held, no certainty about where this would go, how it might play out. But for the first time in a long time, I felt alive in a way I hadn't before. And I wasn't about to let fear stand in the way of that. I stood up from the garden bench, the sun now lower in the sky, casting a golden glow on everything it touched. My heart was full, and even though I was scared, I knew one thing for sure. I was ready to embrace this, to see where it could lead, to let myself feel whatever came next, without apology or regret. Love was a gift, no matter the age, and I wasn't about to let it slip through my fingers again. The days that followed were a delicate dance of uncertainty and excitement. I found myself thinking about Daniel often, more than I'd ever imagined I would. He had become a part of my daily thoughts, the quiet rhythm of my life, now punctuated by memories of our time together and the anticipation of what might come next. The fear of judgment still lingered, though not as strongly as before. I no longer cared as much what others might think. It wasn't that I had become indifferent to their opinions. It was simply that what I had with Daniel felt so real, so pure, that I no longer wanted to hide it away in the shadows of fear. I was learning to live for the moments that mattered most to me, not for the approval of those who might never understand. One afternoon, I was sitting by the window, a cup of tea cradled in my hands, watching the world pass by. It struck me how many years I had spent buried in routines, avoiding anything that might shake me out of my comfort zone. But now, I had the courage to embrace the unexpected. I had learned that love didn't follow a script. It was a force that could surprise you at any moment, no matter your age. I smiled to myself, a quiet pride settling in my chest. There had been a time when I would have never allowed myself to pursue something like this. My insecurities, the expectations of others, all those fears had held me back for so long. But now I knew I had something worth fighting for, something that made me feel vibrant, alive, and whole in a way I hadn't felt in years. In the evenings, I would walk through the streets of the city, the cool night air a reminder of how much had changed. The weight of the world no longer felt like a burden. It felt lighter, freer, as if I had unlocked a door I never thought would open again. I thought about what I had learned from this unexpected love, about how it had taught me not to wait for the perfect moment, not to be afraid of breaking the rules. Life wasn't about waiting for everything to align. It was about embracing what came, even if it didn't look the way we expected. Love, I had come to realize, was an experience that could happen at any age. It wasn't confined by time or rules. It wasn't something reserved only for youth or the young-hearted. I could feel love at 54. I could feel desire, passion, and connection, just as deeply as I could at 20. The difference was that I now had the wisdom to appreciate it fully, without fear or hesitation. In the end, I wasn't sure where this journey with Daniel would lead. Maybe it would grow into something deeper, or perhaps it would remain a beautiful, fleeting chapter in my life. What mattered most was that I had let myself experience it without fear. I had learned to trust myself, to trust the power of love, and to trust that sometimes, the most unexpected moments are the ones that change us the most. And as I thought about what was to come, I felt a quiet sense of peace, knowing that I had embraced this new chapter with an open heart, ready for whatever came next. Love had found me when I least expected it, and in that, I had found myself,